The orbital station floated above Earth like a silver needle hanging in the dark. It was clean and white on the inside, with long, quiet hallways and rooms full of important people saying important things in careful voices. Ambassador Alara Voss had worked in places like this for most of her adult life. She knew the smell of recycled air and the hum of artificial gravity and the particular silence that settles over a room when something is about to go very wrong. That morning, and she felt that silence before she even walked through the door. She was 54 years old, with short gray hair and steady brown eyes, and she had represented Earth at the Galactic Council for the last 9 years. She had sat through thousands of sessions. She had heard every version of the speech that told humanity to be patient, to wait its turn, to remember its place in the great order of galactic civilization. She had always been polite. She had always been professional. She had always gone back to her office afterward and written her reports in calm and measured language. But today was not going to be like any of those other days. The 7 senior delegates of the Galactic Council sat in their high seats around the curved table. The room was designed to impress. Tall ceilings, colored light filtering through panels that mimicked the home skies of 7 different worlds, and chairs built for 7 different kinds of bodies. Humanity had 1 seat at this table, 1 small seat at the far end, which was officially called the junior provisional position, as if the name alone was not enough of a message. The head of the council that year was Soravel of the Vrethkai. He was tall and gray-skinned with 4 long arms, and he moved through the world with the slow and easy confidence of a being whose civilization was 4,000 years older than humanity's. And he did not look up from his data slate when Voss entered the room. He did not look up when she sat down. He did not look up when her 2 staff members quietly took their seats behind her. He only looked up when he was ready to speak, and not a moment before. "Ambassador Voss," he said, in the flat and bored tone that powerful beings use when dealing with things they consider minor. "The Council has completed its territorial review of Sector 7G, which your people refer to as your home solar system. The review has determined that several zones within this sector are currently underdeveloped and represent significant resource opportunities for senior member civilizations." Voss sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. "Go on," she said. "The asteroid belt located between your 4th and 5th planets, the 16 primary moons of your 5th planet, and the outer colony rings will be reclassified as a contested development corridor under Article 44 of the Galactic Compact." Soravel turned a page on his data slate without looking up. "These zones will be opened for development and resource extraction by senior council members, beginning 30 planetary rotations from today." Behind Voss, her young aide Theo made a small and involuntary sound, like someone had pressed something sharp against his ribs. Though one of the other human staff members pressed her lips so tightly together they turned white, but Voss herself sat perfectly still, her face showing nothing at all. "You are taking our outer solar system," she said. "We are reclassifying portions of it for shared multilateral development," Soravel said, with a faint note of correction in his voice, as if she had used the wrong word for something. "But you retain full provisional sovereignty over your home planet and your nearest planetary neighbor. This arrangement is entirely consistent with your current classification as a Tier 3 provisional species under the Galactic Compact." "We have colonies on those moons," Voss said. "Hundreds of thousands of human beings live and work there." "They will be accommodated during the transition period," Soravel said. He said it the way a person might say that the old furniture would be carefully moved aside during a home renovation. "I should also note that this decree has already been signed and ratified by the full council. This meeting is a courtesy notification, Ambassador. There is nothing to negotiate here." Voss looked down the length of the table. A delegate from the Cerelian Empire was tapping something quickly on his wrist device, already moving on to the next item of business. The delegate from the Keth Dominion was quietly eating from a small container of food he had brought with him. Another delegate was reading something on a secondary screen and had clearly stopped paying attention entirely. None of them looked troubled. None of them looked apologetic. None of them looked like people who had just handed someone's home system over to strangers. They looked like people sitting through a meeting about something that did not concern them. And that was the moment. Not the decree, not the words, not even the casual theft of human territory. It was the eating, and the tapping, and the secondary screens, and the total absence of anything in those faces that said this moment was even a little bit significant to any of them. 60 years of humanity sitting at the far end of this table, speaking carefully, voting politely, following every rule, and not one of them could be bothered to look up. A Voss reached down and picked up her diplomatic folio, the dark blue folder with the golden seal of Earth pressed into its cover. She had carried it into this chamber hundreds of times. She closed it carefully and held it under her arm. "Thank you for informing us," she said. She stood up and walked out. She did not slam the door. She did not raise her voice. She walked down the long corridor past the framed portraits of every human ambassador who had ever served on this station. He turned into the private communications room at the end of the hall, sat down at the secure console, and opened a priority channel directly to Earth. "I need the Secretary General and a full joint session of Parliament," she told the operator. "Priority classification. Get it done." The Parliament convened within 2 hours. Voss delivered her report in clear and simple language. She told them the facts exactly as they were. And she told them about the decree and the data slates and the food container and the delegate who had stopped listening. She showed them the full text on the shared screen. The debate lasted 6 hours, which was nearly nothing for a body that had once spent 3 weeks arguing about a minor trade revision. This time there was not much to argue about. The vote was 412 in favor of withdrawal, 9 against, and 3 members who chose not to vote at all. For humanity was leaving the Galactic Council, completely and immediately. Voss received the result on her console and read it once. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, walked back to the council chamber, and placed the formal withdrawal document on the table directly in front of Soravel. She told him clearly what it meant. Communication channels closing, diplomatic staff recalled, all access codes changed within 24 hours, every shared agreement now void. And Soravel stared at the document for a long moment. "This is a significant overreaction," he said. "This is a decision," Voss said. "There is a difference." And she walked out for the last time. By nightfall, the lights in the human wing of the station had gone dark. By morning, the data channels were closing one by one. By the end of the week, every human representative on every council world was on their way home. And the great diplomatic machine that humanity had built and maintained for 60 years was going silent. The galaxy barely noticed. It was busy with other things. That would not last very long. For the first few weeks, nobody in the Galactic Council was worried. The withdrawal of humanity was treated in most official circles as a kind of tantrum, the impulsive reaction of a young and emotional species that had taken a routine administrative decision far too personally. And Soravel gave a short address to the council chamber in which he described the situation as a temporary disruption caused by cultural immaturity. Several delegates laughed quietly at that. The Keth Dominion's senior representative told his staff that humans would come crawling back within a month, embarrassed and eager to reapply for their little seat at the far end of the table. The mood across the council's 12-member worlds was relaxed. Life went on. Trade continued. The warships patrolled their usual routes. Scientists published their papers and politicians gave their speeches, and nobody thought very seriously about the small blue planet that had just gone quiet. Then, at the start of the second month, a junior technician on the Sorelian homeworld named Feng Shui sat down at his workstation, ran his morning diagnostics, and found something that made him go very still. The cybersecurity wall protecting the Corellian Empire's primary government network, the one that guarded financial systems, military communications, and the personal records of 4 billion citizens, had started showing critical gaps. Not because anyone had attacked it, it was simply degrading, quietly and steadily, from the inside. Feng Shui ran the diagnostic 3 more times before he called his supervisor. His supervisor called her director. Her director called the Minister of Systems. 3 days later, after a great deal of shouting behind closed doors, the answer became clear. The architecture of the entire security wall had been designed and built by a human contractor company called Bridgepoint Systems. The contract had expired 6 weeks ago. Bridgepoint had sent renewal notices for 3 months in a row, which had been ignored because nobody in the Corellian procurement office had thought a human company was important enough to prioritize. Now the system was running without updates, without patches, and without the maintenance protocols that human engineers had baked into its core. Without those engineers, it was like a body trying to heal itself without an immune system. The Corellians quietly filed an emergency request to reopen communications with Earth. Earth did not respond. In the 3rd month, something stranger happened in deep space. But the Keth Dominion's fleet of deep-range exploration vessels began reporting navigational errors. Small ones at first. A degree off course here. A timing miscalculation there. But the errors grew over the following weeks. 3 ships had to abort their missions entirely and return to port. 2 others drifted several thousand kilometers off their planned routes before their crews managed to manually correct the problem. A full technical investigation was ordered. The results were not good. 97% of the navigational buoys spread across the outer spiral lanes, the little automated satellites that kept every ship in the galaxy on course through the empty dark, ran on firmware that had been written and maintained by human engineers at a company called Waymark Navigation Solutions. Without regular updates from Waymark, the buoys were slowly losing calibration. They were still working, but they were drifting, and in deep space. The small drifts became very large problems very quickly. The Keth Dominion sent an urgent message to Earth. The automated response system informed them that Earth's external communication channels were currently unavailable and invited them to try again at a future date. By the 4th month, the situation had spread to places no one had predicted. The Great Interstellar Medical Exchange, the largest shared pharmaceutical and biological database in the known galaxy, and which every member species used for disease research, medication synthesis, and medical emergency response, was hosted on server architecture based on the human continent of North America. When the withdrawal locked human networks, the exchange did not go down all at once. It went down slowly, section by section, as access permissions expired and were not renewed. Species that had relied on the exchange to synthesize critical medicines suddenly found their requests returning error codes. A Corellian medical official stood before her government's emergency health committee and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm, that 17 ongoing treatment programs for serious illnesses across the empire were now operating without access to current research data. She had tried to find alternative databases. There were none that came close. In the 5th month, the Council's intelligence bodies, which were very good at finding information but apparently had not been looking in the right direction, completed a comprehensive review of exactly how much of the galaxy's working infrastructure had been quietly built, coded, maintained, and updated by humans during the 60 years of their membership. The report was marked classified almost immediately. But the people who read it sat in their offices for a long time afterward and did not say anything. And the picture that emerged was not of a junior species that had sat quietly and obediently in its small seat. It was the picture of a species that had spent 60 years doing the work that everyone else considered beneath them. The difficult, unglamorous, technical work of making systems run and keeping networks alive and solving the problems that more powerful civilizations were too proud or too busy to address themselves. Humans had not been building weapons or armies or political alliances, and they had been building things that worked. And then, they had kept those things working quietly and reliably for 6 decades, while the senior species of the galaxy sat in their high seats and ate their snacks and looked at their secondary screens. Nobody had noticed because nobody had thought to look. Why would you look closely at the people fixing your pipes? The word that kept appearing in the intelligence reports, circled and underlined and flagged in several languages, it was one that most of the Council species had never had to think about in relation to humanity before. The word was dependency. By the 6th month, the mood in the Council chambers had changed considerably. The easy laughter about cultural immaturity was gone. Soravel's calm had developed a thin crack running through it, visible to anyone watching carefully. And the delegate from the Keth Dominion, the one who had said humanity would come crawling back within a month, had stopped making predictions entirely. Emergency working groups were formed. Senior engineers were pulled out of retirement. Vast sums of money were approved for emergency reverse engineering projects. Species that had been barely on speaking terms with each other began holding quiet, urgent, deeply uncomfortable meetings about how to share what little technical knowledge they had. The galaxy was starting to understand something that it really should have understood a long time ago. The small, young, emotional junior species at the far end of the table had not just been sitting there. It had been holding quite a lot of the table up, and now it had gone home. Panic is not a word that ancient and powerful civilizations like to associate with themselves. The Vrethkai had governed star systems for 4,000 years. And the Keth Dominion had fought and won wars that lasted centuries. The Sorelian Empire had outlasted the collapse of 3 other galactic alliances without breaking stride. These were species that moved slowly and deliberately, that measured decisions in decades, that considered themselves far above the messy emotional reactions of younger civilizations. But there is a thing that happens to even the most composed and dignified being when the systems they depend on start failing one after another. A thing that looks very much like panic, even if nobody calls it that. It started in the Council's own capital city on the planet Velshara, in the deep underground levels where the infrastructure of the city's government district was housed. A technician named Orath Su was running standard maintenance checks on the atmospheric processing system, the network of machines that kept the air in the government district clean, breathable, and at the right temperature, when he discovered that the emergency override system required a biometric authorization key. That was not unusual. Emergency overrides on critical systems always required special keys. What was unusual was that the key in question was a human biometric key. That Orath Su stared at his screen for a very long time. Then he pulled up the system's history and traced the override function back through 7 years of maintenance logs. The atmospheric system had been upgraded 7 years ago by a human engineering team from a company called Clean Air Systems. As part of that upgrade, the team had linked the emergency override function to their own company's authorization protocols, standard procedure for the systems they built, and something that had been signed off on by the Velsharan Municipal Authority at the time without any particular concern. Nobody had thought to transfer that authorization key to a local authority afterward. It had simply never come up. Now the emergency override for the atmospheric processors in the Galactic Council's capital government district could only be activated by a human biometric signature, and humans were not speaking to them. And 3 council members sent formal diplomatic envoys to Earth that week. All 3 were met with the same automated reply: polite, professional, and completely unhelpful. One of the envoys, a senior Sorelian diplomat who had been in the service for 40 years, sat in front of his screen and read the automated response 3 times with an expression on his face that his staff had never seen before. By the 9th month, the emergency council sessions were running around the clock. They had been going for weeks, and the chamber that had once hosted slow and stately proceedings now had the frantic energy of a room where everyone was trying to solve a different disaster at the same time. Species that had not cooperated on anything in living memory were sitting next to each other, sharing technical documents and asking questions they had never imagined they would need to ask. Wei Keth engineer sat beside a Sorelian programmer, and together they tried to understand the architecture of a human-built water purification algorithm that kept the recycling systems on 3 colony stations running. They worked for 11 days. At the end of it, they had a partial understanding, which was better than nothing, but nowhere near enough to actually replicate what it did. Sorel sat at the head of the table through all of these sessions. He was still composed. He was still precise, but the people who worked closely with him noticed that he had stopped making the small, dismissive sounds he used to make when junior staff brought him concerning news. He had also stopped referring to the human withdrawal as a temporary disruption. The thing that finally broke the surface calm, the thing that made even the most composed delegates sit up very straight in their chairs, happened in the 10th month, when the Gator Collective made a decision that most of the council privately considered unwise. The Gator were a reptilian species, large and aggressive and not known for their patience. They had watched the crisis unfolding and had decided that the correct response was not negotiation, but pressure. They assembled a war fleet, 62 vessels well armed and crewed by some of the best soldiers in the Gator military, and moved it toward the outer edge of human-controlled space. To positioning it clearly as a threat, the message was simple: give the Council access to your systems or face consequences. The fleet traveled for 3 days without incident. On the 4th day, the navigational updates to the Gator vessels stopped arriving. Not because of any attack, not because any weapon was fired. The route mapping satellites in that region of space simply stopped sending updated data to ships that were no longer recognized as authorized users. And the satellites were human-built, human-owned, and currently set to deny service to all non-authorized vessels. And nobody had thought to check whether Gator military ships were on the authorized list before sending the fleet out. The ships did not crash. They were in open space, and open space is mostly empty. But they could not navigate safely forward without current mapping data, and the data was not coming. After 2 days of trying to work around the problem and failing, but the fleet commander, a decorated general who had never retreated from anything in his career, turned the fleet around. The Gator government said nothing publicly about what had happened, but privately several of their senior ministers requested urgent meetings with their intelligence services to discuss exactly how deep the human technological presence went in their own national systems. The answer, when it came back, was deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, on Earth, life was going on in a way that struck the few alien observers with open communication channels as almost unreal. Factories were running at full capacity. The outer colonies, the ones the Council had tried to reclassify, were expanding their infrastructure. Scientists were publishing research at a remarkable pace. Children were going to school. People were eating dinner and watching programs and arguing about small things and living their lives without any sign of crisis. A popular morning news program on Earth broadcast a short comedy segment in which the host joked that humanity had apparently been holding up more than our end of the deal for 60 years without receiving so much as a thank you note. The studio audience laughed. The clip was shared widely across the remaining open communication networks. On Velshara, a council aide found the clip and showed it to Sorel. Sorel watched it once. His expression did not change. But for a long time after the screen went dark, he did not say anything, and he did not look at anyone. The aide wisely chose not to say anything either. The scramble continued. Working groups failed and were replaced by new working groups. Emergency budgets were approved and spent. Engineers worked through the night on a dozen planets, and slowly through all of it. A single clear thought was forming in the minds of the most senior beings in the galaxy. A thought that was simple and obvious and extraordinarily difficult to admit. They needed to call Earth. They needed to call Earth, and they needed to do it on Earth's terms. The question was how to do that without losing what remained of their dignity. The answer was that there was no way to do it without losing what remained of their dignity. That was simply the situation they were in. In 4,000 years of recorded interstellar history, the Galactic Council had never formally requested a meeting on another species' territory. It simply had not happened. The Council held its sessions on Velshara, or on neutral orbital platforms that it owned and controlled. The idea of traveling to a member species' home planet and sitting down at their table, in their building on their terms, was the kind of thing that would have been considered unthinkable 12 months ago. And the formal request arrived at Earth's government channels on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was written in careful and polished language and diplomatic language, the kind that is designed to say difficult things without sounding like it is saying difficult things. But the meaning underneath the careful words was clear enough. The Council wanted to talk. It wanted to talk at a time and place of humanity's choosing. It was prepared to travel to Earth to do so. So Secretary General Dae-Jung Park read the request at his desk, then read it a second time. He was a small, precise man in his early 60s with reading glasses that he always pushed up his nose when he was thinking hard. He pushed them up 3 times before he called his senior staff into the office. "They want to come here," he said. His chief advisor, a tall woman named Calloway, looked at the document and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What do we want?" It was the right question. The answer took 2 weeks of internal discussions, legal reviews, and very detailed consultations with everyone from infrastructure engineers to constitutional scholars to the leaders of the outer colonies, the people who had actually been living in the zones the Council had tried to take from them. When the process was finished, Secretary General Park had a document on his desk that was not very long but was extremely clear. It was not a readmission application. It was not a peace offering. It was not a humble request to return to the small seat at the far end of the table. It was a new agreement, written entirely by humans, and it said exactly what humanity required. The delegation that arrived in Geneva 18 months after Voss had walked out of the council chamber was unlike any council delegation that had ever traveled anywhere. There were no grand speeches at the landing port, or there was no ceremonial display of power. There was a group of senior diplomats in formal dress who walked quietly through the arrivals hall of a human airport, cleared customs like everyone else, and were taken by ordinary ground vehicles to the Geneva Summit Hall. Soravel was among them. He was still tall, still gray-skinned, still composed, but the slowness in his movements had changed its character. It was no longer the slowness of a being who had all the time in the world. It was the careful slowness of someone who was choosing each step very deliberately. The Summit Hall was a large, clean building overlooking a lake. The meeting room had a long table with good chairs and windows that let in the natural light of an Earth afternoon. There were no high seats. There was no junior provisional position. Everyone sat at the same height. Secretary General Park was already seated when the council delegation entered. The Ambassador Voss sat to his right. She had come out of retirement for this, at the government's personal request. Beside them sat engineers, scientists, legal experts, and the elected representatives of the outer colonies, ordinary people who built and maintained and repaired things, alongside the diplomats. Park waited until everyone was seated. Then he placed the document on the table and let everyone read it. The room was very quiet while they did. The document's requirements were straightforward. Humanity was to be immediately reclassified as a Tier 1 sovereign species with full veto rights, applied retroactively to cover the 60 years of their membership. Every rezoning decree affecting human-claimed space was to be declared permanently void, effective immediately. All infrastructure built, coded, designed, or maintained by human individuals or companies was to be formally recognized as human intellectual and sovereign property under galactic law. Any future council decision that affected a species' home system required the unanimous agreement of all members, not a simple majority. And a new permanent seat, the Infrastructure and Development Chair, was to be created and held by humanity. There was no room for negotiation. Park did not say that, but the document made it clear enough on its own. A junior delegate from the Sorelian Empire leaned over to his superior and whispered something in a low voice. His superior, a being who had governed star systems for 2 centuries, listened, nodded slowly, and picked up the signing stylus. The other delegates followed, one by one, reading the document a final time before they signed. Soravel was last. He held the stylus for a long moment. He looked at the document, and then he looked across the table at Voss. She looked back at him, calm and still and not unkind, but absolutely without any doubt in her eyes about how this moment was going to end. The silence stretched between them for several seconds. Then Soravel signed. Park gathered the signed copies with both hands, squared the pages neatly on the table, and set them aside. We will resume infrastructure access and communication services on a scheduled basis over the next 60 days, he said. Our technical teams will be in contact with your systems managers to coordinate the restoration process. He said it the way someone might say that the renovation was finished and the furniture would be moved back in shortly. There was something in the room after that. Not celebration, not gloating, not triumph. It was something quieter and more solid than any of those things. The council delegates sat with it in their own way. Some looked at the table, some looked at the windows, so some looked at the humans sitting across from them with expressions that were difficult to name. One of the outer colony representatives, a young man named Santos, who had grown up on one of the Jupiter moon stations and who had watched the council's reclassification decree arrive on a news screen in a break room at his work site, sat very straight in his chair and did not say anything at all. But his eyes were bright. After the signing, as the delegations were preparing to leave, Soravel stopped near the door. He turned and looked at Voss, who was gathering her papers at the table. "You planned this," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was not quite a question either. Voss looked up at him. "No," she said. "We just did our jobs. For 60 years, we just did our jobs." She paused. "You should have paid more attention." Soravel was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a slow, small nod, the kind of nod that takes a great deal to produce, and walked out. Voss watched him go. Then she picked up her folio, tucked it under her arm, and followed him into the afternoon light. Outside, the lake was still and the sky was clear, and the planet that the galaxy had tried to take pieces of turned quietly on its axis, same as it always had, same as it always would. The years that followed were not dramatic. There was no great war. There was no sweeping revolution. There were no triumphant speeches broadcast across the galaxy, no grand gestures, and no moments designed for history books. The change that had happened was quieter than all of that, and it went deeper than any of those things could have reached. But things were different. Anyone with eyes could see that things were different. On the Keth Dominion's academic world of Serath, a young diplomatic student named Yiln Shaya sat in her university library 3 years after the Geneva signing and wrote the final chapter of her thesis. She was 22 years old, and her thesis argued something that most of her professors had marked with cautious red notes in the margins, something that the older generation of scholars found uncomfortable and the younger generation found obvious. Her argument was simple. Humanity had never needed the Galactic Council. The Council had needed humanity. It had needed humanity from the very first decade of human membership, and it had simply never looked closely enough to realize it. The Compact's tier system, with its Tier 3 provisional categories and its junior seats and its courtesy notifications, had been built on the assumption that newer species were receiving something valuable from their membership. protection, access, legitimacy, and that this was what gave the senior species their power over them. But humanity had been the one quietly providing something valuable. It had been providing the working layer underneath all the grand politics and ceremonies, the code and the maintenance and the firmware and the data systems that kept galactic civilization functioning day to day. The Compact had handed power to the species with the oldest ships and the longest histories, when the real power had been sitting all along with the species that showed up reliably and fixed what was broken. Her thesis was controversial. It received a high grade and 4 very tense evaluation meetings. Within 2 years, it was required reading in diplomatic programs on 6 different worlds. On the Vrethkai home world, a new wing of the Central History Museum opened 5 years after Geneva. It was a large and well-lit space with high ceilings and careful lighting, and it contained artifacts and displays and recorded testimonies organized around a single subject. And the exhibit was called The Species We Underestimated, and it told the full story of humanity's 60 years in the Council, the withdrawal, and the crisis that followed. It did not tell the story in a flattering way, not for the Vrethkai, and not for anyone else. It was honest in a way that institutional museums rarely manage to be. Visitors walked through reconstructions of the sessions where human concerns had been dismissed, past displays showing the scope of the infrastructure failure, past a recording of the Geneva signing that played on a loop in a quiet room at the end of the exhibit. The museum expected moderate attendance. It was the most visited exhibit on the planet for 11 consecutive years. A Vrethkai schoolteacher who brought her students through the exhibit on a field trip in the 7th year after its opening was asked by one of her students, a small child with enormous gray eyes, why the people in the old council sessions had not paid more attention to the humans. The teacher thought about it for a moment. "Because they assumed they already knew everything important about them," she said. "That is a very old mistake." It is also a very common one." The child nodded seriously and wrote something in his school notebook. In Geneva, on a wide stone plaza near the lake, a statue was unveiled 6 years after the signing. It was not a large statue, and there had been some debate about whether it was right to put one up at all. Voss herself had said publicly that she found the whole idea embarrassing. But the Parliament had voted for it, and the outer colony councils had contributed to the funding. And so there it stood. It showed Voss mid-stride, slightly forward-leaning, the way she walked when she had somewhere to go and intended to get there. The diplomatic folio was tucked under her arm. Her face was calm. The door behind her was open, and she was not looking back at it. The plaque beneath the statue read, "She did not raise her voice. She did not have to." Voss came to see it on the morning it was unveiled, stood in front of it for a moment. I said, "I look nothing like that," in a tone of mild complaint, and then laughed at herself and went to get coffee. In the council chamber on Velshara, the infrastructure and development chair was placed at the head of the curved table, not at the far end. The first human to hold the position was a quiet engineer from Nigeria named Dr. Adaeze Okafor, who had spent 20 years building water purification systems on 3 different planets, and who had never intended to go into politics at all. She arrived at her first council session with a battered notebook full of handwritten calculations and asked, in her first official statement, whether anyone had reviewed the maintenance schedule for the Deep Space Relay Network recently, because some of the numbers she had seen were concerning. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Sorelian delegate said that no, they had not, and perhaps the chair could arrange a full technical review. Dr. Okafor said she would have a preliminary report ready within the week. She had the report ready in 3 days, and then there was the last thing. The thing that happened 9 years after Geneva, in the same council chamber where the original decree had been read out in a flat and bored voice to a room full of delegates looking at their screens. A new species had been found in the outer arm of the galaxy, small and curious and still learning to navigate beyond their own solar system, and they were brought before the council for their provisional membership assessment. The traditional procedure was for the chair to deliver the standard address about Tier 3 status, limited rights, and the contested development framework that applied to newly admitted species. Soravel, who was still a delegate, older now and considerably quieter, reached for his data slate out of habit. Then he stopped. He looked across the chamber at Dr. Okafor. Dr. Okafor was already looking back at him. A Secretary General Park, sitting in the human delegation's seats in the first row, leaned slightly forward. At the head of the table, Dr. Okafor set down her own data slate, looked at the small, nervous delegation from the new species standing at the entrance to the chamber and smiled at them. An ordinary, straightforward human smile. "Welcome," she said. "You do not have a tier here. You have a seat. Sit down, and let us tell you how this works." The new delegates looked at each other, and then they walked forward and sat down. In the front row, Park sat back in his chair and looked up at the high ceiling of the chamber for a moment. Outside, through the long windows, the stars were the same stars they had always been, countless and cold and burning far away. But the room felt different than it once had. It felt like a room where the work actually mattered, and where the people doing it knew that it did. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough.